No official statement was issued. No cameras captured the moment. Yet within palace circles, whispers spread with unusual speed after Prince Harry was reportedly seen near a restricted area of Kensington Palace, connected to Princess Catherine's recovery schedule. By nightfall, schedules shifted. Aides became guarded, and one senior royal, Princess Anne, was said to have decided enough was enough. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For weeks, the atmosphere surrounding Princess Catherine's recovery had reportedly been unlike anything royal observers had seen in recent years. Public engagements had become carefully measured. Internal calendars were said to be tightly controlled. Even routine movements around private areas of Kensington Palace were, according to palace reporting and long-standing royal practices, handled with unusual sensitivity. Officially, the focus remained simple: health, family, and stability. Unofficially, however, there appeared to be a growing awareness that privacy itself had become one of the palace's most protected assets. That is why the whispers, when they surfaced, spread so quickly. According to reports and speculation circulating among royal commentators and palace watch circles, Prince Harry's presence near an area associated with Catherine's recovery arrangements triggered questions that extended far beyond geography. No public allegation emerged. No confirmed breach was announced. Yet observers began asking a different question entirely: why now? Those close to royal operations have often suggested that during periods of medical recovery, access becomes more symbolic than physical. It is not merely about entering rooms or crossing corridors. It is about respecting invisible boundaries. Boundaries built around routine, trust, and an understanding that certain moments remain outside public conflict. As the conversations intensified, something else reportedly changed. Staff who were normally described as approachable became unusually careful with language. Briefings narrowed. Familiar informal reassurances appeared to disappear. People who usually dismissed speculation reportedly declined to comment altogether. To experienced royal watchers, silence has always carried meaning, not because it confirms anything, but because it signals caution. At the center of all this stood Prince William. Publicly, there was no visible reaction, no statement, no correction. But those who follow the royal family closely have long noted William's tendency to move inward during periods of pressure. His priority, according to years of reporting and public patterns, has consistently remained the same: protect the immediate family circle first, deal with consequences later. That priority mattered now more than ever. Catherine's recovery had already become the subject of intense attention. Every appearance, every absence, every adjustment had generated endless interpretation. The last thing the household needed, according to those who framed the situation this way, was another emotional flashpoint attached to an already difficult period. And then there was Princess Anne. If she was concerned, she gave no outward sign. That, some would argue, made the speculation around her involvement more compelling. Anne's reputation over decades has rarely been built on public displays. She does not enter stories loudly. She appears after patterns emerge. Reports suggest she continued with her schedule, maintained her routines, and offered nothing that could be interpreted as reaction. Yet among palace observers, that restraint was interpreted not as indifference, but as attention. Because when Anne becomes interested in a situation, the assumption is rarely that she intends to create drama. The assumption is usually that she intends to understand it. And perhaps that was what unsettled people most, not the rumors themselves, not even the silence that followed, but the possibility that private concerns had begun intersecting with something larger than one family moment. Because concern inside the palace wasn't centered on Harry's presence alone, it was about what his appearance seemed to symbolize. Royal residences have invisible borders lines enforced not by guards alone, but by decades of protocol. And insiders often describe one principle above all others: private recovery spaces remain untouched. That was why the conversation inside palace watch circles did not fade after the initial whispers. Instead, it deepened. Because within royal life, rules are rarely important only because they exist. They matter because of what they protect. For generations, the monarchy has operated through two systems at once: the visible institution and the unwritten institution. The visible institution appears in ceremonies, announcements, and public appearances. The unwritten institution governs everything else. It determines who enters certain rooms, who speaks during sensitive moments, who waits, who leaves, and sometimes, who simply understands that presence itself can carry consequences. Medical privacy has long belonged to that second world. Official details are often limited. Access becomes narrower. Information moves carefully. Not because secrecy is treated as power, but because control becomes a form of stability. During periods of illness, recovery, or personal strain, royal households have historically operated under customs that place dignity above curiosity and structure above emotion. That context mattered. By all public accounts, Princess Catherine's recovery period had already become one of the most closely watched and emotionally charged chapters in recent royal life. Every public adjustment seemed to invite new interpretation. Every quiet week generated fresh speculation. Under those conditions, even ordinary movements inside palace routines could begin attracting extraordinary attention. And according to the conversations circulating around the palace, Catherine's private recovery arrangements were understood to exist within an unusually protected environment. Not forbidden, not hidden, protected. The distinction mattered more than people realized. Those familiar with royal customs have often described recovery spaces as extensions of family life rather than institutional territory. That changes expectations. A private wing is no longer simply a place, it becomes a boundary around healing, routine, and trust, which is why speculation around unexpected proximity, whether meaningful or misunderstood, can trigger reactions far larger than outsiders expect. Because inside royal culture, symbolism often outweighs logistics. A closed door does not always mean exclusion. Sometimes it means respect. That principle has appeared before in royal history in different forms. Periods of illness, transitions, personal crises, moments where boundaries quietly expanded and public access narrowed, not to create mystery, but to preserve order when pressure from outside became impossible to control. And when those boundaries appear uncertain, attention often shifts toward the people known for defending them. Which brought observers back to Princess Anne. Her reputation was never built around speeches or public corrections. Over decades, she became associated with something less dramatic but arguably more influential: continuity. Rules applied consistently, expectations maintained quietly, problems addressed before becoming public narratives. That reputation changed how people interpreted silence. Because if Anne remained calm, it rarely meant nothing was happening. It often meant something was being measured. At the same time, the palace faced a difficult balance. Compassion could not become chaos. Family could not become spectacle. Every decision carried emotional weight, yet every reaction risked becoming a story of its own. So restraint became strategy. Questions remained unanswered. Speculation continued without confirmation. But inside the institution, there appeared to be growing awareness that boundaries only matter when people believe they still exist. And if protocol had been tested, there was one royal whose response was rarely emotional, and almost always decisive. Princess Anne rarely raises her voice. According to long-standing royal reporting, she rarely needs to. Her authority comes from something more difficult to challenge: consistency. That was why, as speculation continued to circulate and questions refused to disappear, attention gradually shifted away from what Prince Harry may or may not have done, and toward something else entirely: how the palace would respond. Because inside institutions built on continuity, reactions are rarely measured in emotion. They are measured in process. Princess Anne has spent decades building a public image that is almost impossible to separate from duty itself. While headlines often follow louder personalities, Anne's reputation has been shaped by repetition: showing up, maintaining standards, protecting structure, and resisting the temptation to turn internal matters into public theater. Royal commentators have long suggested that this approach became her greatest source of influence. Not visibility, predictability, which is why moments of uncertainty often seem to draw attention toward her. Not because she seeks authority, but because authority quietly gathers around people who consistently choose discipline over reaction. As conversations continued around Catherine's protected recovery arrangements and the unusual sensitivity surrounding palace routines, reports and speculation increasingly framed Anne's role not as confrontation, but consultation. No dramatic intervention, no emotional declarations, just conversations, quiet questions, internal assessments. Those interpretations carried weight because they matched a pattern observers believed they understood. Anne's public history has rarely suggested interest in personal disputes. But institutional questions? That was different. And according to Palace Watch discussions, the issue being weighed was never whether one person had crossed a line in the ordinary sense. The deeper concern appeared to be whether expectations themselves had become uncertain. Because royal households depend on something fragile. Shared understanding. People know when to step forward. People know when to step back. And when those instincts become unclear, even innocent moments can begin creating consequences far larger than anyone intended. That principle may explain why reports increasingly described conversations behind the scenes as practical rather than emotional. No one, according to those interpretations, wanted escalation. They wanted stability. William's position reportedly reflected that same instinct. Publicly, he remained measured. That had become familiar. But observers have often pointed out that William's approach to pressure tends to become more deliberate, not less. During difficult periods, especially involving Catherine and their family, his instinct has rarely been expansion. It has been protection. That alignment mattered. Because if William represented immediate responsibility, Anne represented institutional memory. Together, at least in the way palace observers framed the moment, they appeared less interested in assigning blame than in reinforcing boundaries. Not to punish, not to embarrass, but to preserve confidence that private space remained private. And perhaps that was the detail outsiders underestimated. Inside royal life, discussions are often framed differently than public audiences imagine. They are not always about feelings. They are about precedent. If one exception becomes acceptable, what follows afterward? That question lingered, because once a boundary becomes negotiable, rebuilding it becomes far more difficult. So while headlines searched for conflict and speculation searched for hidden meaning, the conversation said to be taking place appeared colder than that. More controlled, more deliberate, and potentially more significant. What followed, according to Palace Watch speculation, was not dramatic, but it may have carried more weight. No recording exists. No transcript has surfaced. Yet competing accounts imagined the same scene. A quiet room, few words, and Princess Anne asking questions nobody else wanted to ask. By the time those rumors began circulating, the atmosphere around the palace had already changed. Not publicly. Publicly, everything remained measured, disciplined, controlled. But beneath the surface, according to Palace Watch speculation and competing interpretations, attention had shifted from movement to meaning. And that was where the alleged private meeting entered the story. No official confirmation ever appeared. No source stepped forward with details that could be verified. Yet versions of the same rumor kept resurfacing in different forms. That there had been a conversation not heated, not explosive, but deliberate. The kind of conversation that becomes memorable precisely because nothing dramatic happens. Because sometimes the moments that leave the deepest marks are the quietest ones. Those who imagined the exchange described it less as confrontation and more as inquiry. Anne, in these interpretations, was not portrayed as angry. She was portrayed as focused. There is a difference. Anger seeks release. Focus seeks understanding. And according to the way these stories were told, understanding was exactly what she wanted. Not accusations. Not explanations designed for headlines. Clarity. If someone had appeared where expectations suggested they would not, why? If timing had created discomfort, what had been misunderstood? If boundaries had begun to feel uncertain, what did that uncertainty mean moving forward? Questions like that are rarely emotional inside institutions. They are structural. That possibility gave the rumors their unusual weight. Because if the conversation existed at all, palace observers imagined Anne approaching it through the lens she has long been associated with: duty before reaction, order before interpretation, which brought attention, inevitably, toward Harry himself. For years, public conversations surrounding him have often carried a recurring tension: individual identity set against inherited expectation. Different audiences interpret that struggle differently. Some see independence. Others see distance. Some see honesty. Others see fracture. But inside this imagined moment, according to the speculation surrounding it, none of those larger debates mattered. Only one question remained. How do personal intentions coexist with institutional expectations? It is a difficult question because royal life rarely rewards simple answers. Family encourages closeness. Institution demands boundaries. Emotion seeks understanding. Structure demands restraint. And somewhere inside that conflict sits a silence that can become impossible to interpret. Perhaps that was why so many versions of this story described long pauses rather than sharp exchanges. Not because nobody had anything to say, but because everyone understood what words could become once they escaped private walls. And in that possibility lived the real tension. Not anger, consequence. Because conversations inside royal life rarely stay private in the way ordinary conversations do. They gather meaning. They become symbols. They reshape assumptions. So if questions were asked, perhaps they mattered less than whether answers existed. Reports and speculation never produced a conclusion. No dramatic fallout emerged. No public correction followed. Only something harder to define. A feeling among observers that after periods of uncertainty, certain lines had quietly been redrawn. And that may be why the silence afterward attracted more attention than any alleged conversation itself. Because inside royal life, conversations matter less than what changes afterward. There were no dramatic announcements, only small adjustments that royal watchers have learned never to ignore. That was what made the days that followed feel so difficult to interpret. Nothing happened in the way people expect royal stories to unfold. There were no official corrections, no carefully delivered statements, no visible confrontation for the public to dissect. And yet, according to Palace Watch discussions and speculation, something seemed different. Not louder. Tighter. People who follow the rhythms of royal life often argue that institutions rarely communicate change directly. Instead, they communicate through patterns, through schedules, through access, through who appears, who does not, and what suddenly becomes impossible to predict. That was where attention turned. Reports and interpretations began focusing less on the rumored conversation and more on the atmosphere that followed it. Public appearances remained controlled. Expectations remained narrow. Engagement calendars appeared deliberate rather than expansive. The language surrounding Catherine's recovery continued to emphasize steadiness and family priorities. Nothing extraordinary, which, for some observers, made it feel extraordinary. Because royal households have long understood something outsiders sometimes overlook, visibility creates pressure. And pressure during periods of recovery becomes difficult to separate from responsibility. That reality appeared to shape the weeks that followed. The focus, according to public messaging and broader reporting patterns, remained firmly centered on Catherine's well-being. Stability became the language. Consistency became the strategy. Every appearance seemed designed to answer only one question: is the family moving carefully? At the same time, speculation suggested staff routines became more disciplined, not severe, more intentional. People interpreted ordinary caution through the lens of extraordinary rumors. Access conversations attracted more attention. Scheduling decisions became stories. Even silence began producing theories. And that may have been the most revealing development of all. Because once public imagination attaches itself to uncertainty, every neutral action starts feeling loaded. Observers interpreted pauses as strategy, absence as messaging, restraint as consequence. Whether any of those interpretations reflected reality became almost impossible to determine. Yet institutions like the monarchy often operate with a different calculation. They do not always respond to speculation by explaining more. Sometimes they respond by narrowing focus and continuing forward. That approach, according to many who study royal patterns, can frustrate audiences but reassure the institution itself. Say less, protect more, move carefully. If that was the strategy, then it also revealed something deeper beneath the rumors. This was never being framed publicly as a question of conflict. It was being framed as a question of preservation. Preserving routine, preserving recovery, preserving confidence that private family space could remain private. But preservation has a cost, because every boundary reinforced can also become a reminder that trust, once questioned, is difficult to discuss openly, and that possibility lingered quietly beneath everything. No one publicly acknowledged a problem. No one publicly described a solution. Yet conversations among observers gradually moved toward a different question entirely. If moments of uncertainty create distance, how does distance eventually become trust again? Not immediately, not through statements, not through appearances, but through time, repetition, and choices that slowly reshape perception, which may explain why the attention never fully disappeared. Because yet the larger issue may never have been about one hallway or one afternoon. Throughout the speculation, Prince William remained publicly measured, a choice many observers viewed as intentional. By that stage, the conversation had evolved beyond rumors, interpretations, and the endless search for hidden meaning. The focus gradually narrowed toward something quieter and, in many ways, more revealing: how the people closest to the situation chose to behave when attention became impossible to escape. And William's approach stood out, not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. Across years of public life, one pattern has repeatedly emerged around William. During periods of pressure, he becomes more restrained, not more expressive. Where others might explain, clarify, or push back, his public instinct has often appeared to move in the opposite direction. Fewer words, narrower focus, more protection around the people closest to him. For observers watching this period unfold, that restraint began carrying its own meaning. Because if there was one theme that appeared consistently in public messaging and reporting patterns, it was this: Catherine's recovery remained the priority. Everything else seemed secondary. Questions could wait, interpretations could multiply, commentary could continue, but the center of gravity remained unchanged. That detail matters because royal life creates unusual tensions. Public figures are expected to remain visible during private hardship. Personal moments become public conversations before families have fully lived through them. Every silence becomes suspicious. Every adjustment becomes symbolic. And for someone expected to lead one day, the pressure becomes even more complicated. Because leadership inside the monarchy is rarely presented as freedom, it is often framed as containment, containing reaction, containing emotion, containing the instinct to answer every question, simply because questions exist. That may explain why William's position appeared difficult for so many people to interpret. On one side sat history, shared experiences, family memory, relationships shaped long before titles carried weight. On the other side sat responsibility. Protecting Catherine. Protecting routine. Protecting an environment where recovery could remain more important than explanation. That balance is not dramatic in the traditional sense. It is exhausting. And perhaps that was what gave the moment its emotional weight. Because stories about institutions often forget something important, institutions are still carried by people. People balancing loyalty against expectation, memory against obligation, compassion against structure. The challenge is not choosing one over the other. The challenge is carrying both at the same time. According to the interpretations surrounding this period, William's silence did not necessarily read as distance. For some, it looked like discipline. For others, protection. For others still, a sign that certain conversations belong inside family walls rather than public debate. Whatever the interpretation, One thing seemed increasingly clear. His public choices appeared designed to reduce pressure rather than answer curiosity. And that reveals something larger about the burden of future leadership. Sometimes strength is not shown through action. Sometimes it is shown through refusal. Refusal to escalate. Refusal to personalize. Refusal to allow difficult moments to become permanent definitions. But restraint has limits. Because eventually attention moves. Eventually public curiosity stops asking who protected the situation and starts asking who carried the greatest weight inside it. And then attention turned to the person at the center of it all. Princess Catherine said nothing publicly. But in royal life, silence is often interpreted more intensely than statements. By the time attention shifted toward her, the story had already become larger than the original speculation. Questions had expanded. Interpretations had multiplied. Observers had studied routines, timing, schedules, and absences looking for meaning. Yet the person at the center of all of it remained publicly unchanged. No explanation, no clarification, no visible effort to reclaim the narrative. And for many people watching, that silence became the narrative. Over the years, Catherine's public reputation has often been associated with restraint. While modern public life rewards immediacy and encourages response, her approach has repeatedly appeared rooted in something slower and quieter. Speak carefully, reveal selectively, preserve private moments where possible. That approach can appear simple from the outside. It rarely is. Because silence is not the absence of pressure. Sometimes silence is pressure carried privately. During periods of intense public attention, choosing not to explain can become its own form of endurance. Every unanswered question creates more questions. Every quiet week invites interpretation. Every decision not to engage becomes interpreted as strategy, emotion, weakness, strength, or all of them at once. That burden seemed especially present here. Public sympathy around Catherine's recovery had already created an unusual atmosphere. Concern mixed with curiosity. Support mixed with speculation. People wanted updates while simultaneously saying she deserved privacy. They wanted reassurance without intrusion. But those two things do not always coexist easily. And inside that tension, silence became meaningful. Not because silence confirmed anything, but because people naturally search for meaning where information feels incomplete. Observers interpreted restraint as caution. Others interpreted it as resilience. Some saw dignity. Others saw distance. Yet beneath every interpretation sat the same reality. Recovery remained more important than explanation. That may be why public appearances, when they happened, seemed to carry unusual emotional weight. Not because dramatic messages were delivered, but because nothing dramatic was delivered. There is a particular pressure attached to figures who become symbolic. At some point, people stop seeing an individual and begin projecting larger ideas onto them: stability, continuity, reassurance, tradition. That transformation creates admiration. It also creates enormous expectations. Because once someone becomes symbolic, even ordinary choices begin carrying extraordinary meaning. And perhaps that was the quieter story unfolding beneath everything else. Not a question of conflict. Not a question of blame. But a question of what happens when a person trying to recover privately is also expected to reassure publicly. That contradiction has no perfect solution. So instead, the palace appeared to return to something familiar. Limited words. Controlled expectations. A deliberate refusal to compete with speculation. And Catherine herself appeared, at least publicly, to remain aligned with that approach. No attempt to dominate the conversation. No visible effort to settle every rumor. Only the repeated suggestion that some parts of life remain outside public ownership. That choice frustrated some people. It reassured others. But it achieved one thing almost immediately. Attention gradually stopped asking what had happened, and started asking what silence was protecting. In the end, the palace would reveal nothing, and perhaps that was the point. Royal history rarely remembers every conversation. It remembers who protected stability when emotions ran highest. And perhaps that is why stories like this never truly end with answers. They end with interpretations. By the time the speculation slowed and public attention began searching for a final revelation, something unusual had happened. The original question had faded into the background. People were no longer asking whether a moment had happened exactly as rumored. They had moved on to something larger, what that moment represented. Because royal life has always existed in two versions. There is the public narrative, built from appearances, headlines, statements, and carefully observed details. And then there is private reality. The reality no audience fully sees. The reality made of difficult conversations, competing responsibilities, quiet decisions, and moments that never become public record. That gap has always existed. Perhaps it always will. Which is why history so often reaches strange conclusions. It forgets who stood where. It forgets exact wording. It forgets timelines. But it remembers patterns. It remembers who remained steady. And in stories shaped around uncertainty, Princess Anne repeatedly became part of that memory. Not because she appeared at the center, but because she rarely needed to. Over decades, her public identity has become connected to something that institutions value more than attention continuity. The willingness to absorb pressure without turning it into performance. The instinct to preserve structure even when emotions become complicated. That does not make those choices easy. If anything, it may make them lonelier. Because behind every public institution sits a private family. And behind every private family sits people carrying different histories, expectations, loyalties, and hopes. That complexity often disappears once stories reach the public. People search for heroes. People search for villains. But reality rarely organizes itself so cleanly, which may be why this entire chapter, whether interpreted as misunderstanding, caution, symbolism, or simple timing, seemed to circle back to the same priority again and again. Catherine. Not speculation. Not palace mythology. Recovery. Because beneath every discussion about protocol, access, silence, and responsibility remains something more human than institutional strategy. Someone recovering. A family protecting space. People trying to move carefully while the world continued asking for explanations. And perhaps that explains the choice that frustrated some observers and reassured others. The palace never appeared eager to compete with interpretation. No final clarification. No dramatic correction. No emotional public resolution. Only restraint. Only distance. Only the quiet suggestion that not every chapter belongs to public ownership. That kind of silence can seem unsatisfying. But silence has another purpose. Sometimes it protects dignity. Sometimes it allows difficult moments to remain temporary instead of permanent. Sometimes it reminds people that not every unanswered question is an unfinished story. And perhaps that is the cost of royal life that rarely makes headlines. To live publicly while protecting something private. To carry symbolism while remaining human. To accept that people may never know which moments mattered most. Because in the end, history may never record what was said, who paused, or which version of events came closest to reality. But it may remember something else entirely. That stability was protected. That boundaries mattered. That some stories survived precisely because nobody tried to win them in public. Sometimes the most defining royal confrontations are not the ones the world witnesses, but the ones that end with the door quietly closing. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.